Always was, always will be. Aboriginal land.
Welcome to Gadigal country. This always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Remember that it always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Principle of always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Always was, always will be Aboriginal land.
Picture this. It's NAIDOC week in Maitland, New South Wales. Kids as young as 5 are marching down the street chanting always was, always will be Aboriginal land, while holding signs that basically tell every other Australian they don't belong here. Meanwhile, in Canberra, our elected representatives are forced to sit through welcome to country ceremonies like they're guests in their own parliament building. Two different scenes, same agenda. They're systematically teaching our children to hate their own country while forcing our leaders through humiliation rituals designed to make them feel like foreigners in Australia. This isn't about respecting Indigenous culture. This is about psychological warfare. And if you think I'm being dramatic, wait until you see what happened when some politicians finally had the guts to say, enough is enough. Let's start with what happened in Maitland on July 15th, 2025. During NAIDOC week, hundreds of children were marched through the streets chanting slogans that would make any normal Australian's blood boil. Always was, always will be Aboriginal land. That's what 5-year-olds were taught to scream at the top of their lungs. Think about what that actually means. These kids are being programmed to believe that every non-Indigenous Australian is living on stolen land. That their parents, their grandparents, their entire family history in Australia is illegitimate, that they have no right to call themselves Australian. But here's the truly sick part. These children have no idea what they're saying. A 5-year-old doesn't understand the political implications of declaring that 97% of Australians are essentially illegal occupiers. They're just repeating what adults have drilled into them, like little parrots in a propaganda parade. One parent watching the march captured what millions of Australians are thinking. My son came home from school confused, saying he doesn't deserve to live here because he stole land. Leave innocent kids out of politics. But that's exactly the point. They're not leaving kids out of politics. They're weaponizing them. This is psychological child abuse disguised as cultural education. These children are being taught to feel guilty about their own existence, to question their right to be Australian, to see their country as fundamentally illegitimate. It's indoctrination that would make totalitarian regimes proud.
You'll be reminded, as all of us are every time we fly, that you are on Aboriginal land. It's our little way of saying, welcome, invader.
Now let's jump to Canberra, July 23rd, 2025. The opening of Australia's 48th Parliament. Before our elected representatives could even begin discussing the issues facing Australia, they were forced to sit through a welcome to country ceremony and smoking ritual. Think about the absurdity of this. These are people elected by Australian citizens to represent Australian interests in the Australian Parliament. Yet they have to be welcomed to their own country like they're foreign visitors who need permission to be there. But then something extraordinary happened. A group of senators finally did what millions of Australians have been wanting to do for years. They turned their backs on the whole charade, and the reaction from the establishment was immediate and vicious. They called it disrespectful, childish, and disgraceful. Here's what the media won't tell you. This wasn't the first time politicians have protested these ceremonies. Some have been quietly objecting for years, usually alone, but this time was different. This time, multiple representatives joined together because they're finally saying what ordinary Australians have been thinking. We're sick of being welcomed to our own country. As one senator put it perfectly, these divisive performances have worn out their welcome. We're all sick of being welcomed to our own country. When did it become normal for Australian parliamentarians to need permission to enter their own parliament?
And it's also your land. This is
your land, not any longer. It always was, always will be Aboriginal land, according to the activists. And this is what The Voice will deliver to mainstream Australia.
And you don't
will deliver, you know? Okay.
Here's where it gets really sinister. Both of these incidents, the kids chanting anti-Australian slogans and the Parliament humiliation rituals, serve the same psychological purpose. They're designed to make Australians feel like strangers in their own country. The Children's March teaches the next generation that Australia doesn't really belong to Australians. The Parliament ceremonies teach our leaders that they're guests who need to be welcomed by the real owners. It's the same message delivered through different methods. You don't really belong here. This is classic psychological manipulation. Make people question their legitimacy, their right to exist, their connection to their homeland. Once you've achieved that, you can reshape society however you want, because people won't fight for something they don't believe they deserve. The genius of it is that it's wrapped in the language of respect and reconciliation. Anyone who objects gets labelled as racist or disrespectful. It's emotional blackmail on a national scale, and it's working.
Parents were upset, understandably, because their children were told to put their hands on the ground and say, always was, always will be Aboriginal land. And apparently this happens regularly before assemblies. It wasn't a one-off.
What makes this even more disturbing is how completely our institutions have been captured by this agenda. Schools are teaching children to chant anti-Australian slogans. Parliament has made humiliation rituals mandatory. The media attacks anyone who questions it. This didn't happen overnight. It's been a decades-long process of gradually normalising the idea that Australia is illegitimate, that non-Indigenous Australians are occupiers, that we need constant reminders of our supposed guilt. The NAIDOC Week March in Maitland wasn't organised by radical activists. It was supported by local schools, councils and community organisations. The Parliament ceremonies aren't fringe events. They're now considered essential protocol. When the institutions that are supposed to serve all Australians start treating the majority of Australians as illegitimate occupiers, you know the capture is complete.
I could not believe the racist comments that were made to me. And they call me Uncle Tom. They call me this, little pet Aboriginal.
This is why the Parliament protest was so significant. For years, politicians have been going along with these humiliation rituals to avoid being called racist. While most went along to get along, a few consistently objected to ceremonies designed to make them feel like guests in their own country. When media personalities tried to lecture the protesting senators about being disrespectful, one fired back with what millions of Australians were thinking: I have had a gutful. I am Australian. This is my country. I don't need to be welcomed to my own country. That's the response of someone who refuses to be psychologically manipulated, someone who won't accept the premise that they need permission to be Australian in Australia. The fact that establishment politicians walked out when the protesters defended their position shows how threatened they are by anyone who refuses to play along with their psychological games.
If people like the Lydia Thorpes of this world were just honest to say Australia shouldn't exist.
So what's the end game here? Why are they so determined to make Australians feel illegitimate in their own country? It's about power and control. If you can convince people they don't really belong somewhere, they won't fight to preserve it. They'll accept radical changes because they don't feel they have the right to object. The children being taught to chant always was, always will be Aboriginal land are being programmed to accept that Australia as we know it should be dismantled. The politicians being forced through welcome ceremonies are being conditioned to see themselves as temporary caretakers rather than legitimate representatives. This is how you destroy a nation from within, not through military conquest, but through psychological warfare that makes people question their own legitimacy.
There's almost this notion that we are on interlopers on someone else's land and we're not as entitled to feel.
But here's the thing. Australians are waking up. The parent who spoke out about their child's confusion represents millions of families who are fed up with this indoctrination. The senators who turn their backs represent millions of voters who are sick of the humiliation rituals. This isn't about left versus right politics. It's about Australians versus an agenda designed to make us feel like strangers in our own country. People across the political spectrum are starting to see through the manipulation. The reaction to the Parliament protest shows how desperate the establishment is to maintain this psychological control. They know that once Australians stop feeling guilty about being Australian, their whole agenda collapses. We're at a crossroads.
Which means you have a population where the majority feels less than.
We can continue allowing our children to be indoctrinated with anti-Australian propaganda while our leaders submit to daily humiliation rituals. Or we can follow the example of those brave senators and say, enough is enough. This isn't about disrespecting Indigenous culture. It's about refusing to accept that being Australian requires constant apology and self-flagellation. It's about rejecting the idea that our children should be taught to hate their own country. The time for politeness is over, when they're using our kids as weapons against our own nation, when they're turning our parliament into a daily humiliation ritual, when they're systematically destroying Australian unity. That's when decent people need to stand up and say no. Some politicians showed us how. The question is, will the rest of Australia follow their lead, or will we continue letting them destroy our country one ceremony, one chant, one humiliation at a time? The choice is ours. But we need to make it soon before they finish programming an entire generation to believe they don't deserve to call Australia home. To see the latest Australian crisis, click this video here.